Nobody saw it coming. That is the part that stays with you. Not the act itself, though the act was extraordinary enough on its own terms. Not the confrontation that preceded it. Not the aftermath that followed. The part that stays with you is that nobody in that room, not the people who had spent years covering him, not the people who believed they understood how he operates, not even the people who had been watching the tension build for weeks. Nobody saw it coming. Shohei Ohtani picked up the contract. Looked at it for a moment. And tore it in half. Right in front of them. Right in front of the cameras. Right in front of the people who had spent weeks constructing the situation that led to this moment and who were now sitting on the other side of a table watching the physical evidence of their work separated into two pieces by the hands of the man they thought they had figured out. The room did not go quiet this time. This time, the room erupted. And somewhere behind the cameras, somewhere in the space where the people who believed they were running this story had positioned themselves to watch it unfold, someone was smirking. That smirk is where the real story begins. Let's go back further than the contract. Because contracts do not get torn in half without a history. Confrontations do not turn explosive without a timeline. And the ruthless machinery that was operating behind the scenes in the days and weeks before this moment did not appear from nowhere. It was built. Deliberately. By people who understood that the most effective way to control a story about Shohei Ohtani was not to challenge him directly but to construct the conditions around him carefully enough that he would eventually challenge himself. It almost worked. Almost. The broadcast incident began the way most significant things begin, quietly, and in a room that most people never see. There had been negotiations. That much was known, or at least suspected, by the people who pay close enough attention to the space where baseball and media intersect. There had been conversations about access, about representation, about the way Ohtani's story was being told and who was doing the telling. There had been, underneath those conversations, a current of something that the parties involved described differently depending on which side of the table they were sitting on. From one side, it looked like opportunity. A chance to formalize a relationship that had been informal, to put structure around access that had been loosely managed, to create an arrangement that served everyone's interests cleanly and professionally. From Ohtani's side, from the side that had watched those conversations unfold with the particular attentiveness of someone who does not miss subtext, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a cage being built around him, one polite conversation at a time. He didn't say that publicly. He didn't say it in any of the careful, measured press conference answers that he had been giving through the weeks when the negotiations were happening in the background. He sat with it. Processed it. Filed it in the place where he files things that matter but are not yet ready to be acted on. And then the contract arrived. The document itself was not unusual in its appearance. Contracts rarely are. They arrive in the language of professionalism and mutual benefit and carefully constructed legal specificity that can make almost anything sound reasonable if you read it quickly enough. The people who had prepared this one had done so with obvious care. Every clause had been considered. Every potential objection had been anticipated and addressed with the kind of preemptive language that is designed to make the person reading feel that their concerns have already been heard. It was a thorough document. It was also, underneath the thoroughness, a document that asked Ohtani to give up something that the language never directly named. Control. Not in a single dramatic clause that would have been easy to identify and reject. In the accumulated weight of smaller provisions, about approval processes and content rights and the conditions under which his words and image could be used, that individually seemed reasonable and collectively amounted to something that was not reasonable at all. Ohtani read it. He read all of it. That is not a small thing to say about a legal document of this complexity. The assumption, sometimes, with athletes navigating media and commercial arrangements is that the reading is delegated, that the player signs what the people around him have approved, trusting the process without interrogating the details. That assumption had led the people on the other side of this negotiation to believe that the document would land without incident. They had misread their subject completely. Ohtani read it. And then he asked questions. Specific ones. The kind that made the people receiving them understand immediately that the document had been read not just thoroughly but analytically, that the accumulated weight of those smaller provisions had not gone unnoticed, that the thing the language never directly named had been named internally by the person the document was trying to bind. The responses to those questions were where the smirking began. Not in the room. Not visibly. The people on the other side of the negotiation were professionals. They had spent enough time in rooms where large amounts of money and complex power dynamics coexisted to know how to keep their expressions neutral when neutrality served them. They answered Ohtani's questions with the practiced reasonableness of people who have constructed an argument carefully enough to have a response ready for every challenge. But behind the cameras, in the conversations that happened away from the formal negotiation, in the communications between the people managing this process and the people observing it from a distance, the smirking was less carefully concealed. They believed they had him. They believed the document was tight enough, the language careful enough, the professional pressure surrounding the situation sufficient enough, that Ohtani would ultimately do what athletes in his position almost always do. He would sign. Because the alternative, the public confrontation, the broken negotiation, the story that would inevitably follow, seemed too costly. Too disruptive. Too far outside the image of the composed, controlled, professionally managed Shohei Ohtani that had been carefully maintained through every press conference and every post-game interview and every public appearance since he arrived in Los Angeles. They had built their confidence on that image. They had forgotten that the image and the person are not always the same thing. The broadcast incident happened on a day when several things converged. The negotiation had reached what the other side believed was its final stage. The document had been revised twice in response to Ohtani's questions, revised in ways that adjusted the language without adjusting the substance, that moved words around without moving the provisions that those words were protecting. The revisions had been presented as significant concessions. They were not significant concessions. They were the kind of surface adjustments that are made when the goal is to end a conversation rather than resolve it. Ohtani had watched both rounds of revisions arrive with the same careful attention he had brought to the original document. He had noted what changed. He had noted, more importantly, what didn't. And on the day the broadcast cameras were present, on the day that had been arranged, by the people managing this process, as the moment of formal conclusion, the moment where the signing would happen and the arrangement would become official and the story would be written the way they had planned for it to be written, Ohtani finally snapped. Not immediately. Not the moment he walked into the room. He sat down. He accepted the document that was placed in front of him. He looked at it for a moment that lasted longer than the people across from him expected. And then he looked up. His expression, the reporters who were present said afterward, was not angry. That was the detail that kept appearing in every account of what happened next. The expectation, when you describe someone finally snapping, is that what comes through is anger. Heat. The loss of the composure that has been maintained through weeks of quiet negotiation. What came through instead was something colder. Clarity. The expression of someone who has finished processing and arrived at a conclusion and is no longer interested in the conversation that preceded it. He spoke first. Calmly. Directly. He said what the document asked him to give up, named it in plain language without the careful legal framing that had surrounded it through weeks of negotiation. He said what the revisions had and had not changed. He said what the smirking, which he had apparently been more aware of than anyone had realized, communicated about the intentions of the people on the other side of the table. The room, which had been arranged for a signing, had become something else entirely. A reckoning. Then he picked up the contract. The physical act took only a second. Maybe less. The sound it made, that particular sound of paper being separated with force and intention, was not loud in absolute terms. But in a room that had gone completely still, it was the loudest thing anyone had heard all day. 2 pieces. He set them down on the table in front of him. Side by side. With a precision that felt almost deliberate, as if the act of tearing had been controlled enough that even the aftermath was arranged the way he wanted it. Then he stood up. He did not slam the table this time. He did not need to. The contract in 2 pieces on the table was already saying everything that needed to be said about how this meeting had ended and why. He looked at the room. He looked, for just a moment, at the cameras. And then he walked out. The smirking stopped. That is the detail that the people observing from behind the cameras, the ones who had believed, an hour earlier, that they had constructed a situation tight enough to produce only one outcome, carried with them out of the room. The smirking stopped because the confidence that had produced it had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in a way that could be adjusted and recovered from quickly. Fundamentally wrong about the person they had spent weeks believing they understood. Wrong about what he would absorb. Wrong about where his limit was. Wrong about the calculation he had been quietly making while they were making their own. They had looked at the image, composed, controlled, professionally managed, and mistaken it for the whole picture. They had forgotten that the man who stands in the batter's box and swings at the first pitch without hesitation is not a man who has never considered the alternative. He has considered it. He has weighed it. And he has decided, in that particular moment, that waiting is not the right choice. The same man had just sat across a table from them and made the same kind of decision. They had simply not believed he would. The aftermath moved quickly. These things always do, once the contained environment of a negotiation breaks open and the information begins moving through the channels that information moves through when the people who were controlling it no longer can. The broadcast networks responded. The organizational statements arrived. The carefully worded communications that are produced when something has gone publicly sideways and the goal is to reframe without admitting what actually happened. None of them addressed the contract in 2 pieces on the table. None of them addressed the smirking that had happened behind the cameras in the days and weeks before. None of them addressed what Ohtani had said, in plain language, before he stood up, the naming of what the document asked for, the identification of what the revisions had actually changed versus what they had appeared to change, the quiet and devastating accuracy of his read on the intentions of the people he had been sitting across from. They addressed none of it. Because addressing it would have required acknowledging it. And acknowledging it would have required answering a question that had no comfortable answer. How do you smirk at the most prepared, most analytically precise, most quietly dangerous negotiator in the room, and then act surprised when he tears the contract in half? Ohtani has not spoken publicly about what happened in that room. He will, eventually. On his terms. In the setting and the language and the timing that he chooses. That is how he operates. That has always been how he operates. The people who forgot it, who looked at the composure and the careful press conference answers and the professionally managed image and concluded that they were looking at someone who could be managed, will be reminded of it again when he does. There are things about Shohei Ohtani that the numbers capture well. The exit velocity of the first pitch home run. The spin rate of the sweeper that ended the bases-loaded inning. The ERA that nobody quite believes is real. These things are documented. Verifiable. They exist in the record in a form that cannot be revised. But there are other things that the numbers do not capture. The read he has on a room. The patience with which he allows a situation to develop before deciding how to respond to it. The precision with which, when he finally responds, he identifies exactly what needs to be said and does exactly what needs to be done. Those things were on display in that room. The contract in 2 pieces proved it.